Good morning on this lovely dog days of summer here in DC and the rest of the world, apparently. My name is Jennifer Turner. I direct the China Environment Forum at the Wilson Center. I've been here for 23 years, putting on lots of meetings, publications, exploring deeply into China's energy and environmental cooperation with the US, but also do a lot of stuff on water, food safety. We got it all going here. Today, very special green tea chat with my friend Scott Moore, who is the director of what the China Program and
China
Strategic
program.
sorry, the China Program and Strategic Initiatives at University of Pennsylvania. Um, our talk today is about his new book. But before we go further, let's think first. Now, we're in the pandemic. And if the pandemic taught us anything, it's that the world is bound together in shared challenges. And at the center of a lot of these challenges is China. And that's not always a bad thing, Scott points out in his book, but China's at the heart. So you have to think that after years and years of breakneck development in China, that we're seeing Chinese officials, businesses, and institutions playing a critical role in almost every major global issue, from climate change to biotechnology, global health, it's all there. So Scott, his book is published. I just got it in the mail and I read almost all of it, skimmed a few parts at the end because, I just got it, right? But his book is about China's next act, how sustainability and technology are reshaping China's rise and the world's future. And so I have to ask the first question, why did you write this book, Scott? And also, it's not a murder mystery. Could you just tell us briefly what's the big takeaway, which doesn't mean people shouldn't buy the book?
Absolutely, Jennifer. Well, and thanks so much for hosting me to talk about the book. It's brand new, was just published last week. Why did I write it? Well, actually, in some part, it's because of you and the work that you have done at China Environment Forum over the last few years. I was just remembering earlier this morning that I think the first time we met was in 2004. I was trying to string together at that time a kind of concentration in terms of my own study between China and the environment. And at that time, you were really the only person in Washington calling attention to these issues. So it is in no small part thanks to your inspiration that I became interested in this area. And ended up writing this book. The kind of most immediate thing that prompted me to write this book is an experience I had working at the US Department of State back in 2015, 2016. And I had this portfolio or this range of responsibilities called environment, science, technology, and health. Pretty broad. At the time, though, it was viewed as one of the most important kind of spheres or components of the US China relationship. This was a time when we were celebrating the success of US China cooperation on climate change, which really helped to power the Paris Agreement, as well as coming off of a pretty successful example of cooperation in combating the West African Ebola epidemic of 2013, 2014. So it was a time in which people really saw a lot of potential, not just for the US and China to jointly help address these global challenges, but we really expected cooperation in these areas of public health, environment, climate change to really kind of be the foundation of America's relationship with China and the foundation for US China relations. Unfortunately, as we all know, in the decade or so since then, that relationship has worsened across the board. We've seen a lot of challenges around cooperating in response to these shared challenges. Arguably, US China cooperation in public health failed its largest test in the sense of failing to prevent the COVID-19 pandemic. We obviously are still facing a climate crisis. And in the meantime, technology has really become an area of intense geopolitical, economic, ideological competition. So what I wanted to do is try to understand why this kind of vision and all this promise that we felt failed over the last few years, and of course, what we can do differently going forward.
Okay, now in your book, you you're bringing together. You talk about sustainability on one hand and technology on the other, and I want to kind of understand, like, how do these two fit together, and how do they explain where China's heading in the future?
Well, I think the key takeaway from the book as a whole, Jennifer, is that if we want to understand where China is heading in the 21st century and the role that China is going to play in the coming decades, we have to understand two really big bets that Beijing has made. On the one hand, it's sustainability and environmental protection and decarbonization. And on the other hand, in advanced technologies like artificial intelligence, gene editing, robotics, and other areas. And it's the combination of these two big bets that informs a lot of where China is headed in the decades ahead, how China's economy will evolve, how its domestic policy, and even its foreign relations will evolve. One challenge, though, is that because these bets are so big and so vast in scale, it means that China plays a really indispensable role in tackling virtually any global challenge, whether it's the climate crisis or addressing some of the risks from development of artificial intelligence. And that creates a dilemma for those of us abroad, including for most foreign companies, in terms of trying to figure out how you tackle these shared challenges, work together in areas of advanced technology while having really fundamental tensions and disagreements. And one kind of final point that I make in the book is that I think we often have it backwards in the sense that I think there's more we can accomplish in terms of saving the planet, in terms of addressing climate change through competition. And I think we need much more cooperation on emerging technologies, even though we often think of them in the opposite, that tackling climate change is about cooperation, whereas technology is about competition. And I think when it comes to China, we often have that more or less backwards.
Well, I mean, it's actually my climate work for many years. We've had it kind of the umbrella theme is cooperative competitors, that competing the race to the top issue. And but I think that in your book, that I like it how you kind of and it helps me as an environment climate person to look at these other tech sectors that that you say sometimes like you were just saying, competition is good, sometimes cooperation in the other. But let's dive into a little bit about the clean tech development. Oh, before I forget, people who are watching, people are if you look underneath the screen here, there's a little Q&A widget. You can start submitting questions anytime now for Scott, so please do. It's ready and waiting for you. All right, so in the clean tech space, I mean, not even that long ago, decarbonization wasn't a priority. But then we saw very quickly how China just excelled in solar panels, changing the world in terms of promoting electric vehicle technologies, and that. Can you kind of talk a little bit about? I mean, in your book, you had a whole chapter about the state-led science, tech, and innovation. Can you talk a little bit about, like, it worked really well for the clean tech, but maybe it's not working as well for other sectors? Just pick a sector and do a little quick comparison.
Absolutely. Well, and I should make clear that tackling climate change will require some degree of cooperation between the US, China, and other major emitters. That's beyond doubt. But it's not all about cooperation. And in fact, as you point out, I go quite a bit into looking at development of clean tech, not just in China, but in some other important countries like Germany. And one example of that is that clean tech development is actually often driven by geopolitics. Germany's renewable energy policies, which basically gave us utility scale solar PV and to some extent wind, were driven in part by a desire to reduce dependence both on nuclear power at the time as well as Russian gas. And so it was kind of a geopolitical motive that led to that investment in the first place. When it comes to China, China has essentially created a solar PV and wind industry out of nothing in the span of about 20 or so years. It's a remarkable feat, but it's one that has depended pretty intensively on industrial policy, on extensive policy support provided by the government, on a feed-in tariff, which Germany also used to help spur the development of renewables. So it's an approach that gives a lot of play and importance to the state and to close linkages between the state and individual firms, as well as regulators, grid companies, things like that. It's a different model than we have in most countries in the West, for example. But it's one that nonetheless did prove pretty effective in terms of creating China's renewable industry. The problem, of course, is twofold. One, when you look at the US climate policy and to a large extent Europe's as well, the idea is to have these clean green technologies power growth and jobs in the decades ahead. But not everyone can be the leaders in green and renewable energy. And that's where this idea of competition, I think, comes into play. And look, from a climate perspective, we need much more investment in research, development, and deployment, even though solar and wind are scaling really fast, essentially faster than any technology in the history of humanity, as far as we can tell. They're not scaling fast enough to help us avert a climate crisis. So we need that continued investment. And if competition can do that, if you can create a virtuous cycle, that's all the better. One final point I would make on this sort of idea of competition and the role it plays in addressing climate change, though, is mitigation is critically important, reducing greenhouse gas emissions. On the other hand, we are going to need a lot more investment and effort in adaptation. And I think competition can play a role in that as well, particularly in terms of the kind of rivalry that's started, for better and worse, between the U.S., China, and other countries in terms of influence across the world. And if part of that campaign can be helping people adapt, especially the poorest and most marginal populations around the world, to climate change, that from a climate perspective might be a good outcome.
And maybe if we just jump over quickly to maybe another sector, tech sector. I was really, I laughed out loud when you were talking about like the AI, where you called the kind of investment in the policies, it was just like by brute strength to succeed. I mean, you kind of saw that with the solar. I mean, it was just more that we gave a lot of subsidies, and then we yanked them in 2018. Half of the solar power industry collapsed. So it was like solar power Darwinism. So we did have these strong firms. It was kind of a funny way to do it. But tell me a little bit about maybe the AI or the other sector, about the same kind of strategy of using strong industrial policy and immense investment to make it work. Is it working?
Well, that's a great point and observation, Jennifer, that there is a commonality. And that's one thing I do try to draw out in the book in terms of how China has used policy to promote both advanced technologies like artificial intelligence, as well as clean technology, which is, of course, itself an advanced technology in many ways. And it has been this, again, very kind of state-led policy that's depended very heavily on direction from the authorities. In most countries around the world, that approach, which broadly we tend to call industrial policy, has a pretty mixed track record. And in China, that's true in some ways. It's a very inefficient way to channel resources, for example, doesn't always produce the best outcomes in terms of producing the most kind of innovative, cutting edge technology. However, what really makes China different, and again, this is something that underlies the book, is just the sheer scale of the Chinese market. Allows that policy, that kind of state-led approach, to be more effective than it would be elsewhere. It's just that sheer kind of size and scale that helps that policy and that approach to be successful. And so it has enabled China to create a massive renewable energy industry, again, from virtually nothing 20 years ago. It's helped Chinese solar be some of the cheapest in the world, for example. So it has, in some ways, proved successful. I think the question going forward is both how sustainable that is, and certainly you've seen rollbacks in subsidies and other forms of policy support for clean technologies in China just in the last few years. And second, whether that approach is going to be able to power the next generation of technology in areas like advanced carbon capture, utilization, and sequestration, for example, that we're really going to need if we're going to avert the climate crisis, and if China is going to meet its goal to decarbonize on a net zero basis, at least by 2060.
Yeah, I mean, And but some of those more difficult technologies may need actually partnerships. I mean, the US and China had a on again, off again, tried to work together on carbon capture and sequestration. We did work together for many years, actually, even under the G.W. Bush administration, where there was really no talk of climate or very little. We had conversations with China about electric vehicles. Um, so okay, moving forward. I know what I'm going to say. The one point that I was struck with some of these other sectors, like the robotics, is that you said with the sense of scale with the investment, that in some ways China succeeds by simply just deploying the technology. That maybe it's not the best, but it just gets it out there, and they kind of like they blanket the world with their new robots. And I hadn't thought about that before in terms of those kind of technologies.
That's right, and that is an argument that I make in the book, and certainly others who follow China tech issues have as well. That actually, what we kind of see if we look around different measures of innovation and technological development, there really aren't many signs that China is kind of running ahead or kind of out innovating the U.S. and other advanced industrial democracies at the cutting edge. But what is true is that the gap is closing in almost every area, and that China does have significant advantages on the deployment side, which is really critical. Especially when we're thinking about something like clean technology, where the problem isn't just developing it; it's commercializing it and scaling it and deploying it worldwide. And so that's, I think, where a lot of the kind of competitive dimension comes into play with respect to tech. And that is true, by the way, of carbon capture. You're absolutely right that in principle, there should be a lot of complementarity, that's certainly been a focus of U.S.-China climate and energy cooperation in previous years. Unfortunately, like so many other things, it's become a casualty of growing U.S.-China rivalry. And I think that's part of the reason why we have to think both in terms of tackling the climate crisis through competition as well as through cooperation. And we do need both.
Good. All right. So got reminding people to submit questions. Just got my first one from Mr. Tenglier. Doesn't say where he's from. Sorry. But do let me know, people, when you submit questions. How would you rate China's progress in the semiconductor business? Is technological independence by 2025, 2030 realistic? And what is your take on the risk of Chinese military action in order to reunify forcefully with Taiwan to get control of the TSMC to advance technologically?
Let me take I'll do sort of reverse order there. Is the three-part question. Semiconductors are really important. I do not think they are worth risking a major power war. I think certainly there is a tragically high risk of some type of conflict involving Taiwan, but I don't think semiconductors are the whole story, and would not be the kind of main reason why you would have a conflict. So certainly that's a sort of an unimaginable scenario, one we all hope doesn't come to pass. But unfortunately, the risk does seem to be rising, not necessarily because of semiconductors, though. I mean, it's a factor, but I wouldn't say that that's the main thrust. Second thing, technological independence by 2025, 2030, no. In short, I mean, what we've seen really since the onset of the U.S.-China trade war back in 2017, seems like a lifetime ago, but it was only 5 years ago, is that you've kind of had at the margins a kind of chipping away at the interdependencies that exist between China and the U.S. and other countries in terms of supply chains. But the reality is that interdependence at its core is here to stay. It is far too expensive, far too complex, far too difficult to totally unwind those supply chains. And so the kind of idea of, kind of however you want to put it, sovereignty, kind of independence is pretty far-fetched in most industries and sectors. And that's, by the way, important for us to keep in mind. There are a lot of challenges, and I think in areas like biotech, increasingly, both in the U.S. and China, you have more restrictions being placed on investment and collaboration of various kinds. And in some cases that makes sense, but in the big picture, competition is almost always more expensive and difficult than cooperation. So I think where you employ that strategy of competition, it has to be, you basically have to have a really good reason for it, because it's too expensive to employ across the board.
All right, I'm going to bounce this back to the green topic.
Sure.
Do you think you read about a lot of the contradictions in China's ambitious climate pledges? I mean, but again, they're going carbon neutral. It's really throughout their whole economic system. Everyone's decarbonizing. But do you think that China's really committed to going green for the long run? I mean, it looks like they are. What's your thoughts?
Um, in short, yes, but there are a lot of buts. And here's where I think the answer actually has much less to do with China than the realities of the world economy and just where we are in terms of clean tech development. Is it possible to decarbonize within, by 2060? Yes. Is it commercially and kind of politically and practically feasible? At this point, no. It's true that we have several decades to figure it out. And certainly, this is a goal that no less than Xi Jinping has committed China to doing. But no country the scale of China, with as large and sophisticated and diverse an economy, has made and one that's as dependent on heavy industry and manufacturing, has made a commitment like this. And the fact is, it's just sort of uncharted waters. We don't have a clear plan from getting from where we are now to that 2060 goal. It is possible, but it will require leaders from Xi Jinping down to make decarbonization an overriding priority over the next few decades. And unfortunately, there are a lot of things that stand in the way, whether it's trying to fight off macroeconomic headwinds coming out of this most recent surge in terms of COVID, whether it's dealing with the implications of growing tensions over Taiwan and other issues. There are just a lot of headwinds and a lot of other things that could impede progress on decarbonization. So a lot of question marks, but it is possible. That's where I would say what we need, under any circumstance, is a lot more investment in the next generation of hopefully breakthrough clean technologies that are not just technologically feasible in terms of allowing us to decarbonize, but are also the cheapest, easiest, most practical options. We're not there yet.
But I mean, it could be kind of like that I sometimes have seen the 30, 60 kind of declarations on capping carbon and then decarbonization, carbon neutrality is a kind of like a moonshot, kind of inspiring, and there is that, environmental authoritarianism, but we've had a lot of discussions here that doesn't always work. And, but reflecting on how, a lot of China's progress, and even in the US, has happened with the US and China cooperating. I mean, do you see that we're going to get back to that sooner or later, or it's going to look different?
I think in the foreseeable future, unfortunately not. What I would say is two things. One, I think the success of U.S.-China cooperation on climate change was really in kind of shifting the frame and the narrative on climate action. It's again sort of easy to forget now, but before, particularly around Paris, you had essentially an unbridgeable chasm between the advanced industrial countries, which were the U.S. was always a little bit of a special case, but for the most part, really willing to undertake significant commitments to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, and developing countries, which almost without exception were not. And obviously, from a climate perspective, that math doesn't add up. So the success of U.S.-China climate cooperation, added by EU-China climate cooperation and others, was to break that logjam. And get us to a point at which everybody agrees that tackling climate change is a shared objective and one that needs to be taken seriously by all countries. However, the focus that kind of success means that the focus now shifts to actually implementing deep reductions in greenhouse gas emissions. And that's something actually where domestic policy and politics has a bigger role to play than diplomatic cooperation per se. So one thing I would say is that I think the relative importance of U.S.-China diplomatic cooperation is somewhat less than it was a decade ago. It's still important, but I think somewhat less than just pushing really hard on implementation. A final point I would make, and that I do mention in the book, is that I think relations are bad, and they're probably going to go from bad to worse in the next few years. But that being said, there are a lot of fundamental pressures facing contemporary China, and I don't think it's out of the realm of possibility that China kind of undertakes a significant shift away from the policies that it's pursued over the last few years that have underpinned a lot of growing tensions, not just with the U.S., but with a lot of other countries. And one thing I fear is that we're locking ourselves into really antagonistic, kind of policies that should that change occur, which I think, in a more positive direction from an American point of view, we won't be in a position to take advantage of it. And that is something that I fear, especially with respect to these shared challenges like climate change and emerging technologies.
Well, before I ask last question here from Jade, I want to point out too that a lot of the discussions that my forum is going to continue to have in this next year is also about the non-governmental climate and energy cooperation and in biodiversity. There are some success points. I'm a little more optimistic, but I get you with the diplomatic stuff. Oh, had kind of a bunch of questions come in just real quick. One woman, Jade, said, is there equal access to green tech and equal dedication to sustainability for rural China and large cities? Short answer.
Short answer, no. In China, as in most countries, huge rural-urban inequality manifest in sustainability and technology as much as in others. Final point in relation to what you said, Jennifer. A lot of the book is about areas of promising cooperation, and I do think in the environmental arena, biodiversity is one that's actually, it used to be really difficult from a political and diplomatic standpoint, and I think now there are actually a lot of things that are favorable about it, and so I think that's an area in which we should be pushing.
Okay, good. Another quick question from
Sure.
Kay Halpern. How does China's role in Africa and development of the continent's oil and gas sector fit into China's green future? Short answer.
Okay, great question. Could I suggest maybe, Jennifer, we take one more and I'll just answer both of them.
Okay. The other one is on the topic of competition. This is from John Seaman from IFRI in Paris. On the topic of competition with China, in the area of energy transition and climate change, is it possible to imagine rules to ensure fair competition here, given the role of industrial policy in China, but increasingly in many other countries throughout the world? So can we come up with rules to make that competition fair?
Okay, second question. First, in principle, yes. In practice, not in the near future. Too difficult. And trade policy and negotiations are one of the most devilishly tricky parts of international diplomacy, except maybe climate negotiations. So in principle, yes, and that's something I don't think we should totally give up on, but it's going to be tough in the foreseeable future. Question about kind of Chinese overseas investment. Obviously, where this comes most into play is through the Belt and Road and other Chinese overseas investment vehicles and strategies. And there, actually, I think you have seen some positive trends just in the last 2 to 3 years in terms of efforts to make those investments, at least at the margin, more sustainable and kind of socially responsible and responsive to stakeholder interests and to some extent foreign pressure. And that's actually an area in which I think competitive strategies, have played a bit of a role. I wasn't always a fan of particularly the accuracy of some of the criticisms the Trump administration leveled against Belt and Road Initiative, but I think it did play a role in causing China to shift its approach to overseas investment more in favor of some sustainable development criteria. That being said, all of that's pretty early and progress has been very uneven.
I mean, they were asking about oil and gas investments in Africa. I mean, we know that China, Xi Jinping did declare they were going to stop building coal-fired power plants overseas, but no similar pledge for oil and gas, obviously.
Absolutely. Or other fossil fuel infrastructure. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I think that we're bumping against that deadline. So it was quick and dirty, but very insightful. The book's out. I think you guys should read it. Again, I found it for someone who's not fluent in things like AI and robotics. I found it very accessible. I laughed out loud a few times. I don't know if he meant me for laugh out loud a few times, but no, it was really a good book. So
I hope so.
if you're a tech person, you'll gain insights into the clean energy climate space and vice versa. But I want to thank you so much. You did a great job on the book, and yeah, and the rest of you, we're actually, you do mention here about the clean high-speed trains. We're actually on August 10th, we're going to have a meeting, a discussion with 3 folks talking about high-speed trains, both at home and overseas. And so we're going to keep this kind of exploration. So I hope those of you who tuned in today can come into those future meetings. Thank you very much, everyone. And thank you so much, Scott, for your great book and great conversation today. Bye.
Thank you.